Ah, the rail shooter. Today it's a nearly forgotten genre, but in the 80s and 90s nobody could get enough of them, including me. I love these games with their fast and precise action combined with strategic gameplay, and for a while the genre roped in players by the millions. Modern games are usually more about freedom of movement and exploration, but I say there's nothing quite like the purity of a visually intense shooting gallery. This format gave developers the freedom to go wild with their designs, and really create tightly focused sensory experiences even more immersive than any open-world game could be. So let's take a brief look at what rail shooters even are, what makes a good one, and then I'll give you my picks for the top 10 rail shooters of all time. So what is a rail shooter? Well, it's any game that puts you on a predetermined path through a 3D environment, freeing you up to shoot anything that moves while dodging the fire of your enemies. The graphics can be made of 2D sprites, but the world needs to exist in 3 dimensions. Otherwise you're playing a vertical or horizontal scrolling shooter. Great genres in their own right, but they're really their own thing. There are gun-based rail shooters that grew out of the mechanical shooting gallery games of the past, and flying rail shooters that grew out of early space games like Galaga and Zaxxon. All of these games, though, share the same basic game mechanic of propelling you forward through 3D space while you blow away anything and everything. So what do I look for in a good rail shooter? Well, good rail shooters follow a good script. Scripted spawning allows for crazy action and massive set pieces that become more manageable the more you play. Hidden strategies, upgrades, and branching pathways to discover can add some depth. The predetermined path of any rail shooter also allows for a basically unlimited number of surprising and impressive enemy boss fights, which is one of the genre's main hallmarks. But the best rail shooters also have panache. They get the gameplay right too, of course, but in some cases the gameplay almost takes a backseat to the style, and that's okay. This genre turned into a way for developers to really showcase their visual and auditory talents, and all of the games in my top 10 provide their own kind of sensory overload. So without further ado, let's get to it. My top 10 rail shooters of all time. Keep in mind this is all my opinion. Yours may differ and that's okay too. Check out the description below for notes on how I captured each of these. I used real hardware when possible. Number 10. The Afterburner series. After the success of Buck Rogers and Space Harrier, Sega's Yu Suzuki and AM2 amped up the speed, difficulty, and everything else in 1987's classic missile dodging simulator Afterburner, which if nothing else was a showcase for those who had developed some serious arcade skills over the previous decade. Its large flight stick gave players a full upper body workout as the F-14 they were piloting needed to dodge constant and intense enemy fire. This thing was a quarter sucker, and I never got past stage 6 in the arcades, but I sure had fun doing even that. Later home-based games in the series were deeper, better looking, and slightly less difficult, but unfortunately the best of them, Afterburner Climax, has been removed from all online game stores, and it never did get a physical release. But check out Afterburner on PSP, it's a worthy update to the original arcade game. Number 9. Until Dawn: Rush of Blood. This is the darkest game on this list, and at times it's legitimately creepy. Just check out this moment as you pass by a character from a previous game in the series. Being inside the world of Rush of Blood is like a living nightmare, one in which you're given a set of guns and sent down a literal track to shoot stuff. This is an extremely dynamic game, with periods of relative quiet, followed by either jump scares or massive set pieces and boss battles that are physically taxing, as the game often requires you to go in both guns blazing. But this game is one of the best on PSVR, and it's also one of the few literal rail shooters to ever exist. Number 8. Star Wars, the arcade game.
Red 5 standing by.
Almost the game that started it all for the rail shooter genre, but definitely the game that made it popular. In 1983, the original Star Wars trilogy was just concluding, and it's not hard to argue that the saga was at its peak of popularity. When the Star Wars arcade game debuted, it generated crowds around the machine. I can personally remember seeing quarters lined up all the way across. It didn't hurt that it was an extremely fun game, allowing you to participate in the famous Death Star battle, including the trench run, and no one can forget the digitized voices of the real movie characters.
Yahoo! You're all clear, kid!
A real novelty in video games at the time. Unique to this list, the game used simple vector graphics, creating a distinctive and ghostly look. For a brief time, it seemed like Atari might rival Sega in rail shooters, but sadly, this was the high watermark in the company's development in the genre. Try it in Maine, this game still holds up. Number 7, Vampire Knight. Remember that brief period in the early 2000s when everybody was into vampires? Zombies had not yet taken over as the monster du jour, so fresh off the success of House of the Dead, Namco and Sega joined forces to diversify the arcade's undead offerings with this vampire-based shooter. Can a developer rip off one of its own games? Vampire Knight plays almost exactly like House of the Dead, even featuring the trademark Sega-style B-grade English voice acting.
As expected, not bad.
Interesting. Let's see them do better.
But it's got a visual style all its own, and it's a beautiful game, with unique and imaginative level designs and bosses that feel varied and unpredictable. Vampire Knight was originally an arcade game, but at home it supports Namco's Guncon 2, and even came packaged with it. Very interesting considering Sega and Namco were arch rivals at the time. The Guncon is the most accurate series of light guns ever made, so playing this at home feels closer to the arcade experience than any other gun game on this list. Assuming you have a CRT monitor, of course, which is a requirement for standard light guns. Number 6, Planet Harriers. Created for Sega's Hikaru arcade board just as the Dreamcast was faltering, this game was never ported to any home or handheld console. And that's a real shame because it's an absolute blast to play. I played it just once in the arcade, but it was such a memorable experience that I have to include it here. The sort of sequel to Sega's seminal Space Harrier, try saying that 5 times fast, this game is vastly superior while still retaining everything that made the original game great. It's deceptively fast, and one of the most difficult shooters on this list, with a world that feels gigantic and graphics that were mind-boggling at the time, but which still hold up today. The gameplay features the same cursor-based shooting as many of Sega's entries in the genre, with unlimited machine gun fire and up to 8 lockable missiles at a time. Interestingly, you can stop in between levels, or even within a level, at a star shop to replenish life, ammunition, and more. This provides a needed break from the crazy action in the rest of the game. Get yourself a Dreamcast emulator if you want to play this. D-Emule, or however you pronounce that, does okay with it. Number 5, Sin and Punishment. Developer Treasure Games doesn't make a lot of games, but when they do, they don't mess around. Sin and Punishment is the reason I bought an N64, and it's one of the great sleeper hits on any console, easily outdoing Nintendo's own entry in the rail shooter genre, Star Fox 64. Sin and Punishment oozes style, with an angular look that's well suited to the N64, and non-stop bullet hell action lifted straight out of one of their 2D shooters. Yet they make it work just as well in 3D. The levels in this game are a sight to behold. It's almost a shame that you have to concentrate too hard on playing the game to fully enjoy their visual splendor. Bear in mind that, like most Treasure games, this one is not easy, and the odd control scheme takes some getting used to. But it's so worth it. Number 4, the House of the Dead series. Sega's biggest near-term follow-up to their groundbreaking Virtua Cop series took the light gun shooter out of the realm of realism and into a dark fantasy world populated by genetically engineered undead, aka zombies, later updated to mutants in House of the Dead Overkill for some reason. The game played like a faster, gorier version of Virtua Cop, with a George Romero B-grade movie look and feel, but it also added branching pathways and other bonuses. The first 4 games in the series basically followed the same template, with changes like the removal of civilians and different gun types in the later games. But Overkill on the Wii switched up the tone to more of an over-the-top splatterhouse feel that you either love or hate. I personally love it. It also added selectable weapons and weapons upgrades, and more varied and larger set pieces, with the one criticism being occasional drops in frame rate that can mess with timing and aim. I still think it's the best in the series.
Is this some kind of fucking sick joke?
Reload.
Shit! There's something on the roof!
Number 3, The Walking Dead arcade game. It's clear that developers' raw thrills and play mechanics played lots of House of the Dead, because this game plays like a new installment in that series, but with Daryl's crossbow from the Walking Dead TV show as your weapon. Aping House of the Dead so shamelessly is no bad thing, since Sega's kept us waiting so long in between releases, especially when it's done this well. With graphics this good, zombie-killing action this frenetic, and set pieces this frequent and varied. It almost goes without saying that this is the best video game ever based on a TV show. But you don't need to be a fan of it to enjoy this game. It's just a great rail shooter. Unfortunately, for now, you'll have to seek out a real arcade machine to play it. Hopefully someday we'll see it on game consoles, or at least a working emulator.
When they're hungry.
Number 2, Rez. Already a zen-like experience on the Dreamcast and PS2, Sega's Rez feels like it was always intended for VR platforms. Being able to inhabit the Tron-like world of Rez literally gives this game another dimension, allowing players to transport themselves inside a sentient computer struggling for humanity. It's like being inside Data's brain in Star Trek: The Next Generation. The new level created just for VR is mind-blowing, with a visual style that's practically all particle effects. While most popular rail shooters are actually arcade ports, Rez was purpose-built for home consoles, allowing United Game Artists, formerly Sega AM9, to give it a much more laid-back feel. Director Tetsuya Mizuguchi named the game after a song by electronic dance music group Underworld, and his idea for Rez was to simulate synesthesia, a cognitive condition in which one sense can reflect another, for example, seeing or feeling sound and music. This works even more seamlessly in VR. Before I get to number 1, let's take a look at some honorable mentions just out of my top 10. And now it's time for my pick for the best rail shooter of all time. Number 1, Panzer Dragoon Orta. The number 1 game on this list is one of the most difficult but also the most rewarding, with a depth to its gameplay that's unusual to the point of uniqueness within the genre. You can choose between 3 different dragons during gameplay, each with different abilities, and the game encourages you, some would say requires you, to switch between them quickly within each level. Each dragon can also be leveled up, but only if you're using it when the power-up appears, further encouraging you to vary your shooting persona. The game's glide mechanic, in which you can avoid enemy fire, initiate ramming attacks, and move around bosses, provides for a level of movement missing in other rail shooters, without negating the focused pathways that define the genre. The game also remains a visual feast even today, especially if you're playing the beautifully upscaled version on Xbox One. Honestly, my capture doesn't even do it justice, because the game itself runs at a smooth 60 frames per second. Most people thought the original game on the Saturn was beautiful at the time, but Orta is just on another level. Even though it's an original Xbox game, this honestly should be a system seller for the Xbox One. Well, there you have it, my look at rail shooters and my favorites among them. What are some of yours? Leave a comment below and let me know. Otherwise, that's about it for now. I'll see you guys next time.